Under the July sun, the air shimmered with heat and hope. Men in blue marched out of Washington to the sound of fifes and drums, their flags bright, their faces young. Onlookers lined the streets, waving hats and handkerchiefs. Some even followed in carriages carrying picnic baskets as if to a festival. They believed the war would end by nightfall, that one grand charge would put down the rebellion and send the South fleeing. No one imagined that by the end of the day, the fields of Virginia would be covered not with glory, but with the fallen. This was the summer of 1861, the beginning of the war, and the end of innocence. Stay with us and make sure to subscribe, so you don't miss the next episodes in our journey through the American Civil War. The march to Manassas began before dawn. The Union Army, some 35,000 strong, moved slowly, the men sweating beneath heavy wool uniforms. They were clerks, farmers, factory hands. Few had ever heard a shot fired in anger, but they sang as they marched, certain that destiny rode with them. Their commander, Brigadier General Irvin McDowell, had protested the rush to battle. His men were untrained, untested, but Washington was impatient. Congressmen wanted victory. The newspapers demanded action. President Lincoln himself, though cautious, felt the pressure to strike before the Confederacy could grow stronger. Across the rolling hills of northern Virginia waited the Southern Army, 32,000 men under Generals P.G.T. Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston. They too were untested, proud and certain of righteousness. Each side believed that Providence favored their cause. Each believed the other would break first. Between them lay a quiet stream called Bull Run, and the first great test of a divided nation. The morning broke with the crack of cannon fire. Union troops pushed across the stone bridge, driving the Confederates back through the fields. From a distant hill, civilians watched through spyglasses. Carriages lined the roads, their passengers eating sandwiches and laughing as if at a play. They cheered as the blue lines advanced. "This will be over by dinner," one congressman boasted. But war, they would learn, has a cruel way of humbling certainty. By midday, the battlefield dissolved into smoke and chaos. Regiments lost their officers. Drummers dropped their sticks and picked up rifles. Men stumbled through wheat fields and ravines, unable to tell friend from foe. The heat, the noise, the confusion. It was more than any had imagined. On a hilltop near the Henry House, a young Confederate brigadier held his ground. Thomas Jonathan Jackson, a quiet professor from Virginia Military Institute, stood firm as shells burst around him. "Look," cried one Southern officer, pointing to the ridge. "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." The name would stay with him forever. Stonewall Jackson, the symbol of Southern resolve. His men rallied behind him, their battle cries echoing through the smoke. And slowly the tide began to turn. By afternoon, Union soldiers who had marched out singing were stumbling back in panic. Beauregard's counterattack broke their lines. Artillery thundered. Cavalry swept through the fleeing masses. The road to Washington was choked with wagons, guns, and terrified men. Even the spectators, the picnickers and congressmen, joined the stampede. Carriages overturned, horses bolted, the air filled with shouts and the crack of musket fire. It was not the triumphant parade the North had imagined. It was a rout, a painful lesson in the reality of modern war. They came expecting a pageant. They found a nightmare. The Battle of Bull Run was not a victory or a defeat. It was an awakening. As night fell, the hills of Manassas glowed with burning fires and the cries of the wounded. Hundreds lay dying beneath the stars. Soldiers from both sides calling for water, for mercy, for home. A young Union drummer boy, no older than 16, pressed a blood-soaked bandage against his leg and whispered, "I thought it would be glorious." Back in Washington, the shock was immediate. The Capitol trembled with fear. Rumors spread that the Confederate Army would soon march on the city. But no such advance came. The South, just as disorganized, was too exhausted to pursue. For both armies, Bull Run was less a triumph than a mirror, reflecting how unprepared they truly were. In the North, the defeat stung deeply. The newspapers that had called for a quick war now demanded answers. Lincoln, weary and heartsick, walked the halls of the White House in silence. He understood now that this would not be decided in one battle or one summer. The war would be long and the cost terrible. In the South, victory brought jubilation, but also overconfidence. Many believed independence was already won, that one more push would drive the Union to its knees. But the wiser men, even among the Confederates, saw the danger in pride. One officer wrote home, "We have won the first battle, but the hardest lesson lies ahead." Bull Run changed everything. It was no longer a question of who was right, but who could endure. In the weeks that followed, both nations began to grasp what they had unleashed. The romance of banners and brass gave way to the grind of drills and camps. Mothers wept over empty chairs. Young men lined up at recruiting offices, no longer naive but still determined. Some fought for the Union to preserve the Republic, others for the Confederacy to defend their homeland. But all began to understand that the price would be far greater than anyone had dreamed. Among the confusion and grief, a few voices began to rise, voices that spoke of purpose, not just pride. A Northern soldier wrote in his diary, "We fight not for conquest, but for a new birth of the nation." A Southern preacher told his congregation, "If this be God's judgment, we must bear it with courage." The war was no longer a spectacle. It was a crucible, one that would test the very soul of America. When dawn broke after the battle, the field of Bull Run was silent. Smoke drifted through the broken trees. The Henry house lay in ruins. The old widow who had refused to leave killed by stray fire. A Union flag lay torn in the mud. A Confederate drum lay beside it. The two halves of a nation, lying side by side, neither yet victorious. Bull Run was only the beginning. Ahead lay Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, names that would be written in blood and remembered for generations. But for now, in that summer of 1861, the world held its breath. The dream of a quick war was gone. The war for the Union had become a war for survival. And the United States, once united by hope, stood divided by destiny. The nation had marched out to battle thinking it was a story of glory. It returned knowing it was a story of sacrifice. In the aftermath of Bull Run, Washington lay stunned. The capital that had cheered its soldiers into battle now waited in uneasy silence. Hospitals overflowed, streets filled with broken men limping home, their faces hollow with disbelief. For the first time, Americans began to grasp what this war would mean, not just for soldiers, but for a nation that had never known such division. President Lincoln spent sleepless nights in the White House. Pacing the floors, replaying every decision, he had believed, as so many had, that one swift blow could restore the Union. Now he knew the truth. This would be a long and bitter struggle. The Union Army had not been defeated for lack of courage, but for lack of discipline, leadership, and time. It needed something more than a general. It needed a builder. And so Lincoln turned to a young officer, confident, ambitious, and full of energy, George Brinton McClellan. Stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe, so you don't miss the next episodes in our journey through the American Civil War. McClellan was everything the exhausted North wanted: sharp, organized, and unshaken by defeat. At just 34 years old, he had already built a reputation as a brilliant strategist. He rode through the camps in polished boots and a spotless uniform, his dark hair neatly parted, his posture perfect. To the weary soldiers of the Union, he seemed almost a savior. They called him Little Mac, and they adored him. When he took command in July 1861, the army was little more than a mob, demoralized, disorganized, still reeling from the disaster at Bull Run. McClellan went to work with military precision. He trained, drilled, and disciplined his men. He built bridges, dug trenches, and reorganized entire divisions. In a few short months, the ragged remnants of Bull Run were transformed into something new, something proud. They would be called the Army of the Potomac. It was said that when McClellan reviewed his troops, they stood taller, their chests swelling with pride. He gave them back their confidence, and with it their purpose. In the eyes of his men, McClellan was not just a commander. He was the embodiment of Union hope. But behind the polished image, a storm was brewing. Lincoln watched with admiration and growing frustration. He had given McClellan every resource the nation could muster, but the young general seemed unwilling to use it. Months passed. Autumn turned to winter. The army remained camped along the Potomac, splendidly equipped and immaculately drilled, but motionless. McClellan insisted the army wasn't ready. He demanded more men, more horses, more cannons. He believed he was fighting not just a rebellion, but destiny itself. And destiny, he thought, could only be conquered with perfection. But Lincoln, desperate for action, saw hesitation. "General," he once wrote in frustration, "if you are not going to use the army, may I borrow it for a while?" The war was being fought not only on the battlefield, but between pride and patience, between a president's urgency and a general's caution. McClellan's relationship with Lincoln grew tense. He dismissed the president as a well-meaning baboon in private letters, convinced that only he understood the art of war. Lincoln, in turn, endured the insult silently, unwilling to replace the one man who had restored the North's faith. Still, the clock was ticking. Every day of inaction strengthened the Confederacy's defenses. Across the Potomac, the Southern Army entrenched near Manassas. Its own commander, now none other than General Joseph E. Johnston, watched and waited. The two great armies, barely 30 miles apart, stared at each other across the river, each daring the other to move first. The press grew restless. So did Congress. The public, once eager for battle, now demanded victory. The war had become a test of endurance and of nerve. While Washington and Richmond prepared for the next campaign, life in the camps took on a strange rhythm. Men wrote letters home by candlelight, describing the boredom and the cold. They played cards, sang songs, and carved wood to pass the time. Snow fell on tents and rifles alike, muting the sound of distant drums. A Union soldier wrote to his mother, "We drill all day and dream of home all night. The generals make plans and we wait for spring." Another added, "We have the finest army on earth, if only it would march." By early 1862, that march was finally coming. McClellan had a grand design, a bold, sweeping plan to end the rebellion by striking at its heart. He would move his entire army by sea down the Chesapeake Bay, land on the Virginia Peninsula, and advance on Richmond, the Confederate capital, from the east. It was daring, complex, and, if successful, could end the war in a single stroke. Lincoln agreed reluctantly. He feared splitting the army, but McClellan's confidence was infectious. The plan was set in motion. The man who had rebuilt the army was finally ready to unleash it. But even victory would reveal the limits of his greatness. As the Army of the Potomac prepared to sail, the nation watched anxiously. But before McClellan could begin, he fell ill, a sudden fever that kept him bedridden for weeks. Rumors spread wildly. Some said he was near death, others that he exaggerated his illness to avoid risk. When he finally returned to command, his arrogance had grown, and his trust in Lincoln had faded. In secret letters to his wife, McClellan complained of the interference of politicians and imbeciles in high office. To his men, however, he remained a hero, the man who would deliver them to victory. When he rode past their lines, thousands cheered. They didn't know that behind the cheers lay an army still untested by true war. In the South, Confederate leaders watched McClellan's preparations with concern. Their young nation was struggling to organize. Its government knew its resources stretched thin. But they had something the Union did not: the advantage of defense. Every river, every hill, every swamp of Virginia was home turf. And in the Western theater, far from the polished parades of McClellan's army, a different kind of war was taking shape, rough, muddy, and brutal. It was a war of ironclads, riverboats, and relentless determination. And at its center was a man very different from the proud commander of the East, a quiet, rumpled soldier named Ulysses S. Grant. But that story was still to come. As McClellan drilled and planned, another man, unknown, celebrated, was already fighting and winning in the West, and his victories would soon change everything. For now, in the winter of 1862, the Army of the Potomac stood gleaming and ready, its banners snapping in the cold wind. Campfires flickered across the frozen fields of Virginia, stretching for miles, the light of a nation preparing for redemption. In Washington, Lincoln looked out his window toward the Potomac and whispered to a friend, "We are in God's hands, but I wish he would show his plan a little more plainly." The stage was set. The generals had their armies, the people had their hopes, and the nation, still bleeding from Bull Run, waited for spring and the next great test of its courage. The winter of 1862 was cruel and restless. The frozen camps around Washington stood silent, their soldiers weary of drills and speeches. But far to the west, in the valleys of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, the war was alive, raw, and brutal. Here it wasn't fought by polished armies or perfect plans. It was fought by men who endured mud, rain, and blood, and by one commander who would soon redefine what it meant to fight a war. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. Grant had once been forgotten. A quiet man with plain manners, he'd resigned from the army years earlier, drifting through failed business ventures and poverty. When the war began, he returned not out of ambition, but duty. He was unremarkable in appearance, often seen in a wrinkled uniform and muddy boots. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was brief, direct, and without flourish. But in war, where action speaks louder than reputation, Grant was exactly what the Union needed. In early 1862, he led a modest force south from Illinois into Kentucky and Tennessee, the western frontier of the conflict. This region, crossed by vital rivers and railways, was the key to the heart of the Confederacy. If the Union could seize control of the Mississippi and its tributaries, it could split the South in two and strangle its supply lines. Grant understood that better than most. And unlike McClellan in the East, he did not hesitate. In February, the rivers were swollen from winter rain. Grant's troops, many barely trained, moved through freezing mud, their boots sinking deep with every step. Gunboats rumbled along the waterways beside them, their iron hulls gleaming wet in the gray light. The target, two Confederate strongholds guarding the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Fort Henry fell quickly, pounded into submission by Union gunboats. But Fort Donelson was another matter. It stood high on a bluff above the Cumberland, its cannons commanding the river, its garrison determined to hold. Grant's men encircled the fort and began a siege. The weather turned savage, sleet, snow, and wind whipping through the tents. Men froze to their rifles at night. Campfires barely stayed lit in the icy gusts. One soldier wrote, "We are fighting the cold as much as the enemy." Inside the fort, Confederate officers debated escape. Among them was General Simon Bolivar Buckner, an old friend of Grant's from their pre-war days. The irony was bitter. Two former comrades now stood on opposite sides of a nation divided. When the Confederates attempted a breakout, Grant saw through it. Riding to the front, calm and steady under fire, he rallied his men and pushed them back. Then he ordered a full assault. Surrounded and outnumbered, Buckner sent a note requesting terms of surrender. Grant's reply became legend. "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." Those words, unconditional surrender, Grant, would define him. And when Buckner finally surrendered, Grant treated him not as an enemy, but as a friend. "You have done all that could be expected of brave men," he told the captured officers. It was a victory the Union desperately needed. The North erupted in celebration. The flags of the United States once more flew over Kentucky and Tennessee. And for the first time since the war began, the people felt hope. While the East marched in circles, the West was beginning to win, and Grant's name was rising with the smoke of battle. The victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson did more than open rivers. They opened Lincoln's eyes to a new kind of general, one who didn't wait for perfect conditions but made them. Grant didn't talk about war. He fought it, and every time he moved forward. But success came with a cost. After Donelson, the frozen ground thawed into endless mud. Men sank to their knees in muck, wagons broke down, and sickness spread through the camps. Grant pressed on regardless, pushing south toward the rail hub of Corinth, Mississippi. There, another Confederate army was gathering, larger, better organized, and ready to strike. Grant's army camped near a small church called Shiloh Meeting House. The soldiers pitched their tents without entrenchments, expecting rest after weeks of marching. But on the morning of April 6, 1862, the woods around Shiloh erupted with musket fire. The Confederates, led by General Albert Sidney Johnston, launched a surprise attack at dawn. The Union lines staggered backward as men were caught cooking breakfast or still rubbing sleep from their eyes. The air filled with the roar of cannon and the screams of the wounded. For Grant, it was chaos. He was away from the front when the attack began, but when word reached him, he rode hard through the rain and confusion, rallying his men under relentless fire. Shells burst through tree trunks, whole companies were cut down. The sun disappeared behind smoke and storm. Still, Grant never panicked. He ordered reinforcements, stabilized his lines, and refused to retreat. When one of his officers urged withdrawal, Grant's reply was quiet but firm. Retreat? No, we'll lick 'em tomorrow. That night it rained hard. The ground was slick with mud and blood. Grant sat beneath a tree, soaked to the bone, listening to the moans of thousands of wounded men lying between the lines. A fellow officer found him there and said, "It's been the devil's own day." Grant simply nodded and said, "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow, though." And he did. At dawn, reinforced by fresh troops under General Don Carlos Buell, Grant counterattacked. By evening, the Confederates were in retreat. The Union had won, but at a terrible cost. Over 23,000 casualties in 2 days. The nation was horrified. Newspapers called Shiloh a slaughter. But Grant, grim and unflinching, had learned what others had yet to understand. This war would not be won by one glorious battle. It would be won by endurance. Grant's victories came not from genius, but from refusal to quit. He had found the secret of the war: persistence. In the East, McClellan's grand plan still crawled through the mud of Virginia. He built fortifications, drew maps, and wrote reports, but rarely advanced. Grant, by contrast, kept pushing south, following the rivers deeper into the heart of the Confederacy. His success began to attract attention and envy. Critics accused him of carelessness, even drunkenness. Rumors spread through Washington. When asked about them, Lincoln famously replied, "Find out what he drinks and send a case to my other generals." The president saw in Grant something he could trust: determination. Not brilliance, not perfection, but sheer will. In a war that was breaking men faster than it made them, that quality mattered more than any other. By summer, the Union flag flew over much of Tennessee. The Mississippi River, though still contested, was beginning to fall under federal control. The Western armies were changing the course of the war, and in the process, the nation itself was changing, hardening, learning, and bleeding its way toward understanding. In the West, victory was measured in mud and blood. But every step forward brought the Union closer to something greater than survival: redemption. Grant's rise marked a turning point. He wasn't the image of a hero. No polished speeches, no shining armor, but he carried something rarer: quiet resolve. Where others saw obstacles, he saw only the next move. And in that relentless drive, Lincoln saw the general he had been waiting for. The Western victories had given the Union its first real momentum. But even as the rivers flowed blue with triumph, new storms were gathering, on land and at sea. For now, though, the name Ulysses S. Grant had entered history, and America, still bleeding and divided, had found in him a new kind of leader, one who would not rest until the Union was whole again. The year 1862 unfolded like a long, dark storm. The easy promises of a quick war were gone. In their place came endurance, the grinding, relentless weight of a struggle that touched every corner of America. From the muddy trenches of Virginia to the silent docks of Charleston, the nation was learning that victory would not come cheap. The war was changing, and so was the country itself. The drums of battle no longer beat for parades, they beat for survival. Stay with us and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes in our Civil War series, as America marches deeper into its darkest hour. In Washington, President Lincoln faced a terrible truth. The war that had begun as a political crisis was now a total conflict, fought in fields, factories, and hearts. Every letter from the front carried news of sacrifice. Every report from the Treasury spoke of strain. And still, the armies grew. The Union was transforming from a republic of citizens into a nation at war. Farms became supply depots. Rivers became highways for gunboats. Even the oceans, once symbols of distance and peace, now roared with cannon fire. Lincoln had approved a vast naval blockade, a plan to choke the South's lifelines, cutting off trade, weapons, and supplies. It became known as the Anaconda Plan, a slow, suffocating strategy meant to squeeze the Confederacy to death. By the spring of 1862, it was in motion. From the Atlantic to the Gulf of Mexico, Union warships prowled the coast. Sails gave way to steam, wood gave way to iron, and the future of naval warfare was about to be born. The Civil War was not only a battle for land, it was a revolution in technology, in strategy, and in the very meaning of freedom. In early March, off the coast of Virginia, the world witnessed something it had never seen before. The Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia, once a scuttled Union ship, raised and rebuilt with iron plates, steamed into Hampton Roads to break the blockade. Its armor deflected cannonballs like rain. Wooden warships, proud relics of an earlier age, were burned and sunk within hours. The Union fleet seemed doomed, until the arrival of another strange creation. A squat, flat vessel that looked more like a floating raft than a ship. It was the USS Monitor, the Union's answer to the ironclad revolution. For 4 brutal hours, the 2 iron giants dueled at point-blank range. Shells rang off iron, smoke blackened the sky. Spectators on shore could only watch as history turned. When the battle ended, neither ship had sunk, but everything had changed. Wooden navies were finished. The age of iron and industry had begun. The blockade tightened with every month that followed. Cotton, once the lifeblood of the Southern economy, sat rotting on the docks. Southern ports grew silent. Merchants fled. And in towns across the Confederacy, hunger began to bite. Meanwhile, in the North, factories thundered. Men and women labored day and night forging rifles, shells, rails, and ships. The Union was becoming a war machine, driven by purpose, fueled by desperation. Yet even as it grew stronger, divisions deepened. Some Northerners demanded peace. Others demanded vengeance. Lincoln stood between them, patient, burdened, but resolute. He still spoke of restoring the Union, but in his heart, he had begun to see the deeper meaning of the struggle, that a nation built on liberty could not endure half slave and half free. In the Confederate capital of Richmond, hope flickered but did not die. The blockade strangled, but the Southern spirit refused to break. President Jefferson Davis rallied his people with words of defiance. Planters gave up fortunes for the cause, and from the hills and farmlands came a steady stream of volunteers, poor men fighting for a land they called home. But the South faced its own divisions. Its fields, stripped of men, lay unplanted, its cities starved. And yet, through all the hardship, the conviction remained: independence or nothing. As the smoke spread across land and sea, the war's true enemy revealed itself: time. Every day that passed brought more graves, more sorrow, and less certainty about what victory even meant. In April 1862, news from the West electrified the nation. Grant had taken Fort Donelson. And in the months that followed, the Mississippi Valley became a Union river. New Orleans, the largest city in the South, fell to Union forces under Admiral David Farragut. The key to the Confederacy, Lincoln called it, is in our hands. But victory was never complete. Each triumph brought new costs, new burdens, new questions. How long could the Union endure this bleeding? How long could the South resist before breaking? Back in Virginia, McClellan finally began his Peninsula Campaign, his long-awaited push toward Richmond. His army, vast and disciplined, moved slowly through the swamps and rivers of eastern Virginia. At first, he met little resistance, but as he closed in on the Confederate capital, a new figure emerged from the fog of war, quiet, steady, and brilliant. General Robert E. Lee had been cautious, reserved, reluctant even to take command. But when he did, everything changed. His genius for defense, his daring counterattacks, and his belief in divine destiny turned the tide. By midsummer, McClellan's great advance collapsed in retreat. The road to Richmond was littered with Union dead, and the myth of easy victory was gone for good. The war now stretched from ocean to ocean, from river to mountain. It consumed everything: gold, grain, men, and faith. And in its fire, America was forging something new, something yet undefined. In small towns across the North and South, life bent under the strain. Mothers waited by windows for letters that never came. Children grew up without fathers. Church bells tolled endlessly for the fallen. The war had become not just a national struggle, but a personal one, fought in every home, every heart. Lincoln, carrying the burden of every loss, found solace only in purpose. "I hope to God," he wrote, "that I have not been wrong." But he knew that the war was changing him, shaping him into something more than a politician. It was turning him into a man of destiny. The old America was dying, and from its ashes, something new was beginning to rise. But before rebirth, there must be reckoning. By the year's end, both sides had glimpsed the shape of the struggle to come. The Confederacy fought on, battered but defiant. The Union stood stronger, but far from victory. And Lincoln began to sense that this war, this terrible, necessary war, might decide not just the fate of a nation, but the fate of freedom itself. In the months ahead, the rivers would run red. Shiloh and Cheatham, names that would sear themselves into history. Grant would rise higher. Lee would emerge as his equal. And Lincoln would take the first steps toward a proclamation that would change the moral heart of the conflict forever. The war had begun as a question of union. It was becoming a war for the soul of humanity, and as the cannons thundered, the world watched, from London, from Paris, from every corner of civilization, wondering if the great American experiment could survive its own ideals. The smoke of battle was spreading across continents, across consciences, and in its shadow, the destiny of freedom itself trembled. Stay with us and subscribe, so you don't miss the next episode of our Civil War series where the rivers of the West and the fields of Maryland run red with history's bloodiest days, where Grant and Lee rise from the chaos, where Lincoln begins to see beyond victory toward emancipation. Join us next time as America steps into the crucible of blood and iron.